Welcome to True Crime Case Files. In this episode, we delve into the dark and twisted tale of Brandon Thibodeau, an 18-year-old whose life was brutally cut short in a shocking crime that left a community in shock. A quiet suburb, a deadly affair. Metairie, Louisiana, a quiet suburb of New Orleans, was the last place you'd expect to find a crime scene. But on a sweltering summer morning, August 12, 2012, the tranquility of this neighborhood was shattered. Brandon Thibodeau, a life cut short. Brandon was a bright and ambitious young man, full of dreams and hope for the future. As a senior at East Jefferson High School, he excelled in academics and auto shop, with a real passion for cars. His friends often saw him with grease-stained hands, tinkering with old cars in his driveway. Brandon lived with his grandmother Mabel, a blind woman who needed his daily care. Despite his age, Brandon took on the responsibility with maturity far beyond his years, balancing school, a part-time job at a local garage, and caring for his grandmother without complaint. A complicated love life. Brandon had been dating Lee Gerard, also 18, for 2 years. Lee was a smart and driven young woman who shared his dreams of a bright future. They talked about getting married after graduation and starting a family. Brandon often saved his money to take Lee out to nice places like CFE Bull, where they would dream about their future over a nice meal. The couple was inseparable and everyone expected them to have a long, happy life together. But beneath the surface there was a dark secret. Brandon was having an affair with Lee's mother, Poet Gerard, a 43-year-old woman who ran a multi-level marketing company called Beauty Buys. A secret that would change everything. Poet was attractive and successful, but she had a complicated relationship with her daughter, often competing with her for the attention of men. Brandon's affair with Poet was a secret that weighed heavily on him, complicating his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. Despite his dreams and plans, Brandon's life took a tragic turn. His secret affair would soon lead to a shocking and violent end, leaving the community of Metairie stunned, and his loved ones devastated by the loss of a young man who had so much potential. A morning of horror. On the morning of August 12, 2012, Mabel, Brandon's grandmother, noticed something was wrong. She hadn't heard him moving around the house that morning, and despite her disability, she managed to dial a neighbor, Mrs. Alice Dupree, for help. Mrs. Dupree, a retired nurse who lived just 2 houses down, rushed over, having known Brandon since he was a little boy. But as soon as she stepped into the house, she felt a chill. The living room was eerily quiet, and there was an unusual metallic smell in the air. Mrs. Dupree called out to Brandon, but the house remained silent. She followed the scent to Brandon's bedroom, and as she pushed the door open, the sight before her was unimaginable. Brandon's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, practically floating in his own blood. He had been brutally stabbed multiple times, and his eyes... A grisly discovery. As Mrs. Dupree entered Brandon's bedroom, she was met with a sight that would haunt her for years. Brandon's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, practically floating in his own blood. The knife, still soaked in blood, was on the floor beside him. Mrs. Dupree froze in shock, her hand trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice, usually calm and reassuring, was shaky as she reported the scene to the operator. "Oh, Sheriff, there's blood everywhere," she stammered. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived at the modest one-story home on West Mitty Avenue. The flashing lights and the crowd of neighbors who gathered outside added to the surreal atmosphere. As the first responders entered the house, they were met with a gruesome scene that would haunt them for years. Mrs. Dupree, who had initially tried to stay calm, was now visibly shaken, leaning on another neighbor for support. Mabel, still in her chair in the living room, kept asking what was happening, unaware of the horror just a few rooms away. The Metairie Police Department arrived at Brandon Thibodeau's home within minutes of Mrs. Dupree's 911 call on the morning of August 12, 2012. Leading the investigation was Detective Michael Duval, a seasoned investigator with over 20 years on the force, known for his no-nonsense approach and dedication. He was joined by Detective Renee Martinez, a younger, sharp-minded officer with a keen eye for detail. As they entered the house, the crime scene was immediately overwhelming. The once cozy bedroom was now a gruesome sight, with blood spattered on the walls and floor, creating a chaotic pattern that told the story of extreme violence and desperation. Detective Duval, despite his years of experience, couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach as he surveyed the scene. He knew immediately that this wasn't a random act of violence. The ferocity of the attack suggested something deeply personal. This wasn't just a murder. Duval believed this was a crime of passion. Martinez began photographing the scene, carefully documenting every detail. They collected evidence meticulously, ensuring nothing was overlooked. The knife, the blood patterns, and any fingerprints were all carefully recorded. Forensics would later analyze these to piece together the sequence of events. As they worked, the detectives also noted the state of the rest of the house. The living room where Brandon's grandmother Mabel sat remained untouched, a stark contrast to the horror in the bedroom. This indicated that the attack was swift, catching Brandon off guard, possibly during an early morning routine. Outside, the neighbors had gathered, murmuring among themselves, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had struck their quiet community. Detective Duval knew the importance of acting quickly. He assigned officers to canvass the neighborhood, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual in a close-knit place like Metairie, where everyone knew each other. There was always the chance that someone had noticed something that could break the case wide open. The first suspect on Detective Duval's list was Poet Gerard, the mother of Brandon's girlfriend, Lee. Poet was 43 years old and had always been the center of attention in Metarie's social circles. She was known for her striking looks and her successful multi-level marketing company, Beauty Buys, which sold cosmetics and skincare products. Some locals whispered that her business was a scam, but Poet dismissed the criticism, enjoying the financial rewards and the spotlight. Poet Gerard, the mother of Brandon's girlfriend Lee, was brought in for questioning. She dressed impeccably in a tailored pantsuit, her makeup flawless, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that didn't go unnoticed. Detective Duval started with routine questions, asking about her relationship with Brandon and her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Poet claimed that she had been home alone, working late into the night on her business. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to her tone when asked about Brandon. She described him as a beautiful boy but downplayed their relationship, referring to him as just her daughter's boyfriend. However, as the questioning continued, Poet's mask began to slip. When Duval pressed her about the affair, her demeanor changed. She became defensive, her answers short and clipped. She denied the affair at first, but when presented with evidence of the affair, she broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed to the affair, but she vehemently denied having anything to do with Brandon's murder. "He was my angel boy," she cried. "I would never hurt him." Despite her emotional outburst, Detective Duval wasn't convinced. Her obsession with Brandon and the intense jealousy she harbored toward her daughter made her a prime suspect. The second suspect in the investigation was Lee Gerard, the 18-year-old daughter of Poet Gerard and the girlfriend of the victim, Brandon Thibodeau. Lee was a bright, ambitious young woman who had just graduated high school in June of 2012. She was looking forward to starting college in the fall, with plans to study business management at the University of New Orleans. Friends and family described Lee as kind-hearted, but sometimes overshadowed by her mother's dominant personality. Lee and Brandon had been dating for 2 years, and by all accounts, they were deeply in love. They had even talked about getting married after Lee finished high school, a plan that had excited both of their families. However, the revelation of her mother's affair with Brandon had shattered Lee's world. The discovery of the betrayal left her heartbroken and furious. But she claimed that she was innocent of any involvement in Brandon's death. When detectives brought Lee in for questioning, she appeared emotionally drained, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt from her high school. She seemed much younger than her age, almost childlike in her grief. Detective Duval and Detective Martinez began the interrogation gently, asking her to recount her relationship with Brandon and how she found out about the affair. Lee's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes filled with tears. Lee described how she had accidentally stumbled upon sexually explicit texts between her mother and Brandon a few days before his death. The discovery had led to a heated argument between her and Poet, but Lee claimed she had tried to move past it. "I loved Brandon and I didn't want to lose him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. However, when asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, Lee's story became less clear. She insisted that she had been at a sleepover at her friend Taylor's house just a few blocks away from Brandon's house, but she struggled to provide details about the evening. Taylor, when questioned separately, confirmed that Lee had been there, but mentioned that Lee had left around midnight, a few hours before the estimated time of the murder. As the detectives pressed Lee further, her demeanor shifted from sadness to defensiveness. She denied any involvement in Brandon's death, but the anger in her voice was evident. "I would never hurt him," she repeated, though her hands trembled as she spoke. When shown evidence of the affair, including Poet's explicit texts sent to Brandon, Lee broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her grief was raw, but it also raised questions. Was she crying out of loss, or was there something more she was hiding? Despite her emotional state, Lee maintained her innocence throughout the interrogation, admitting to feeling betrayed and angry, but insisting she wasn't capable of murder. However, her unclear alibi and the intensity of her emotions left Detective Duvall with lingering doubts. The third suspect in the investigation was Richard "Golly" Gerard, the 47-year-old father of Lee Gerard and husband of Poet Gerard. Richard was a successful lawyer known locally as an ambulance chaser due to his reputation for taking on personal injury cases. He was well known in Metairie, Louisiana, for his sharp legal mind and his ability to win cases, but also for his tendency to be absent from home due to his demanding work schedule. Richard was a man who valued appearances. He took pride in maintaining a picture-perfect family image, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the troubles brewing under his own roof. While Richard was often away from the office or in court, he wasn't entirely oblivious to the tension and game of sexual cat and mouse between Poet and Lee. He had his suspicions about Poet's behavior, particularly her inappropriate sexual interest in other men, but he chose to ignore it, hoping it would resolve itself. When the police called Richard in for questioning, he appeared composed, dressed in a crisp white shirt and tie, as if preparing for a day in court. Detective Duvall and Detective Martinez started the interrogation by asking Richard about his relationship with his wife and daughter. Richard described his marriage to Poet as complicated, but insisted that they had a strong bond and had sex regularly. He claimed that his relationship with Lee was also on good terms, though he admitted that they weren't as close as he would have liked, partly due to his long work hours. The detectives then shifted the focus to Brandon Thibodeau.
I liked Brandon. Thought he was a good match for Lee.
However, when confronted with the affair between Brandon and Poet, Richard's demeanor changed. He clenched his jaw and avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the topic.
If I had known, I would have put a stop to it immediately.
The detectives pressed Richard on his whereabouts on the night of the murder.
I had been working late at my office, reviewing a case file for an upcoming trial. You can ask my colleagues, they can vouch for me.
Richard's response to the interrogation was calm but distant, giving the impression that he was holding back. As the questioning continued, Richard maintained his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with Brandon's death. However, his reluctance to discuss the affair and his apparent detachment from the situation left the detectives with more questions than answers. Was Richard truly ignorant of his wife's actions, or was he hiding something to protect his family's reputation? Despite his calm exterior, Richard's evasiveness during the interrogation raised suspicions. The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. On a scorching afternoon in mid-August 2021, the police received a tip that would change the course of the investigation. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Detective Duvall's phone rang. The caller, who wished to remain anonymous, claimed to have critical information about Poet Gerard, one of the key suspects in Brandon Thibodeau's murder. The tipster hinted at something more sinister than just an affair, a secret that Poet had been hiding for years.
This could be the break we've been waiting for. Let's follow up on this lead immediately.
The detectives wasted no time and drove straight to Poet's office, located in a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of Metairie. The sign above the door read Beauty Buys, the name of the multi-level marketing company Poet had been running for nearly a decade. From the outside, the office looked like any other small business, but inside, the detectives would uncover a shocking twist.
As they entered the office, the detectives were struck by the eerie quiet. The place was filled with beauty products, shelves lined with creams, lotions, and makeup, but there were no employees in sight.
Detective Martinez noticed a locked door at the back of the office. After some persuasion, Poet's assistant, a nervous young woman in her early 20s, reluctantly handed over the key.
Behind the door was Poet's private office, and what the detectives found inside was both disturbing and revealing.
The walls were covered with photographs, many nude, of Brandon. Most of them were sexually explicit and inappropriate. In one corner there was a makeshift love shrine dedicated to him, complete with candles, trinkets, and handwritten notes. It was clear that Poet's obsession with Brandon had gone far beyond a mere affair, but that wasn't all. As the detectives searched the office, they stumbled upon a stack of documents that exposed the dark side of beauty buys. The pyramid scheme was not just a business, it was a scam that preyed on poor Southern women, many of whom were single mothers struggling financially. The documents revealed that Poet had been exploiting these women, convincing them to invest thousands of dollars in beauty products they couldn't sell, while forcing them to work up to 20 hours a day to pay off their debts. The financial strain had ruined hundreds of lives, leaving these women in despair. The discovery of Poet's fraudulent business practices provided a new motive for the murder. Poet's world was beginning to crumble, and the pressure of maintaining her image, combined with her obsessive love for Brandon, may have driven her to kill. With this new evidence, the police had a clearer picture of Poet, a woman who would do anything to protect her secrets, even if it meant committing murder. The detectives knew they were closing in on the truth, but they also realized that uncovering the full extent of Poet's crimes would be no easy task. On August 21, 2021, the police in Metairie, Louisiana were finally ready to make their move. After piecing together the evidence, including the disturbing findings at Poet's Beauty Buy's office, they had no doubt about who was responsible for Brandon Thibodeau's brutal murder.
Paula Gard, 43, had become increasingly sexually obsessed with her daughter's boyfriend, leading her to commit an unthinkable crime. Paula Gard was known as a charismatic and successful businesswoman, running a multi-level marketing company called Beauty Buys. But behind her polished exterior, Poet was hiding dark secrets.
The investigation revealed that she had been having an affair with Brandon for several months. When Brandon tried to end the affair to focus on his relationship with Poet's daughter Lee, Poet's obsession turned deadly. On the night of the murder, Poet confronted Brandon in the kitchen of his grandmother's house, a place Brandon had taken Poet to have sex many times. Fueled by jealousy and the fear of losing control, Poet grabbed the kitchen knife and stabbed Brandon multiple times. The attack was vicious, leaving him with deep wounds and nearly gouged out eyes. After the murder, Poet tried to cover her tracks, but her obsession with Brandon and her fraudulent business dealings eventually led the police straight to her. The arrest took place in the early morning hours of August 21st. The police arrived at Poet's upscale home in a quiet suburban neighborhood just as the sun was rising. They knocked on the door and Poet answered, still dressed in her silk pajamas, clearly not expecting visitors. The detectives calmly informed Poet that she was under arrest for the murder of Brandon Thibodeau. Poet's reaction was a mixture of shock and defiance. She tried to maintain her composure, but the police could see the panic in her eyes as she was handcuffed and led to the police car. Her neighbors watched in disbelief, many of whom had admired Poet for her business success, not knowing the truth behind her glamorous facade. The news of her arrest spread quickly through the community, and by the time the police car pulled away, the streets were buzzing with gossip. Back at the station, Poet was booked and placed in a holding cell. The detectives interviewed her, but she denied everything, insisting that she was innocent. However, the evidence against her was overwhelming, and the police were confident they had the right person. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Brandon's family, who had been living in fear and uncertainty since his death. The case was far from over, but with Poet in custody, the police were one step closer to achieving justice for Brandon Thibodeau. The trial of Poet Gerard for the murder of Brandon Thibodeau began on November 8, 2021, at the Jefferson Parish Courthouse in Metairie, Louisiana. The case had drawn significant media attention, with local news outlets like the Times-Picayune covering every detail. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Mark Tremble, a seasoned lawyer known for his tenacity in the courtroom. Tremble, 52, had a reputation for being thorough and reliable, and this case was no exception. From the outset, he painted a damning picture of Poet as a woman driven by jealousy and obsession. He argued that Poet had brutally murdered Brandon in a fit of rage after he tried to end their affair, using the physical evidence and testimony from investigators to support his case. Tremble also exposed Poet's venal business, beauty buys, as a fraudulent scheme that preyed on vulnerable women, adding to the portrait of her as a manipulative and dangerous individual. The defense. On the defense side was attorney Charles Chuck Lameau, a sharp and experienced lawyer with a history of defending high-profile clients. Lameau, 48, was known for his calm demeanor and ability to create doubt in the minds of jurors. He argued that the evidence against Poet was circumstantial and suggested that someone else, possibly Lee Gerard, could have committed the crime. Lameau also tried to humanize Poet, portraying her as a loving mother and successful businesswoman who had been unfairly targeted by the media and the prosecution. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on Brandon's family was evident. His grandmother, who had raised him, attended every session, clutching a worn photograph of Brandon. His girlfriend, Lee Gerard, sat with her father, both of them visibly shaken by the proceedings. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, especially during the testimony of the lead detective, who detailed the gruesome nature of Brandon's injuries and the evidence linking Poet to the crime. On November 22, 2021, after 2 weeks of testimony and just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Paula Gerard was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with tears of relief from Brandon's family, while Poet remained stoic, though the color drained from her face as the words guilty echoed through the courtroom. The punishment was handed down on December 1, 2021. Poet was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a harsh but fitting end to a case that had shocked the community. For Brandon's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but the pain of losing him would never fully heal. The trial had also exposed the dark side of Poet's business, leading to further investigations into beauty buys and its practices. The sentencing marked the end of one chapter, but left many in the community reflecting on the tragedy and its lasting impact. After the trial, life in Metairie, Louisiana slowly returned to normal, but the shock of Brandon Thibodeau's murder lingered in the community. The close-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business was forever changed. The once bustling Gerard household became quiet. Poet's life sentence left a void in the family that was hard to fill. Her husband, Richard Golly Gerard, a successful lawyer, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the scandal and loss weighed heavily on him. He continued his work but withdrew from social circles, avoiding the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed him everywhere he went. Lee Gerard, Poet's daughter, struggled to move forward. The revelation of her mother's affair with Brandon and the brutal. In the Brandon Thibodeau murder case, Poet Gerard was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial began on November 8, 2021, and after 2 weeks of testimony and just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. The case received significant media attention, with local news outlets like WLTV covering every detail. The trial brought a sense of justice for Brandon's family, but the pain of losing him will never fully heal. The trial also exposed the dark side of Poet's business, beauty buys, which was revealed to be a fraudulent scheme that preyed on vulnerable women. The company came under intense scrutiny, leading to its eventual shutdown and a cautionary tale about the dangers of predatory businesses. The consequences of one person's actions can have a significant impact on an entire community.